This is a map of Chicago's train system. If you look at its design, it's not hard to figure out what it was built to do. All its different lines intersect here in Chicago's downtown, and then fan outward. This is a system that's really good at moving people between the suburbs or the outer rings of the city and downtown. But that's not really useful to my friend Nina.
I am a Chicago resident and I live in Avondale. I drive to work every day. I drive 25 minutes to Elmwood Park, which is a suburb right on the border of the city.
Nina actually lives right by a bus stop and a train stop. But if she commuted that way,
I could take the bus down Addison, but the bus route stops at the border of the city. So it would be a pretty long walk, like 45-minute walk maybe. Or maybe I could take the train down to the loop, and then I would have to get on the metro, which is the train that goes to the suburb.
Nina said she would commute on public transit if it made sense.
I'm sorry, man, but Atlanta is not a walkable city. No. There's highways that cut right through the center of the downtown. Here you can see more of it. I've been there. There are walkable areas, you're right. But the city is not remotely walkable. You need a car to exist in that city for 99% of people. And I'm not hating on you, I get it. I think Americans just have an extremely warped idea of what walkable is. If you need a car to live in the city, it's not walkable.
Damn! This bitch must be parked downtown Atlanta!
You think there's no demand for public transit in the United States? Look at here, sold out from San Francisco to LA. 11 and 9-hour train journey, sold out. With high-speed rail, that could be taken down to 2 hours. But people are still willing to do 11 hours in a train. In a high-speed train going 200 miles an hour, you could get from LA to Atlanta in 11 hours. Get across the country, train arrives and departs on time with no turbulence or cancellation, sign me up.
This is Indiana, and this is Scotland. Both have a similar number of inhabitants, a similar size, and a similar population density. But here's Indiana's public transportation system, and here's Scotland's. You want to get to Cooper, a town of 9,030 miles from the capital? That'll take you 55 minutes on a train that leaves every 30 minutes, or an hour and 40 minutes on a bus that leaves every 40. You want to get to Anderson, a town of 50,030 miles from Indiana's capital? Well, you're out of luck. The only option is the car. Antiquated technology, safety concerns, crumbling infrastructure, and non-existence, it's not hard to argue that the US public transportation network is just not good. Vast swaths of the US have no option but to drive because the alternative just is not there. This has consequences on the environment, on economic mobility, on where people live. The consequences of America's lack of solid public transportation almost defines American culture. But it wasn't always like this. The United States once had the best public transportation system in the world. It was the admiration of countries worldwide and an essential factor allowing for the successful Western expansion of the country. It all started with this, the horse car. Now, there were urban transportation systems before these horse-drawn trams came along, but they weren't cheap and they weren't fast. Roads generally weren't paved, and there just wasn't the economic demand for high-frequency service because these carriages were rarely faster than walking. But on rails, these horse cars were fast, and one horse could pull a full load of passengers thanks to the rails. In its heyday, there were over 6,000 miles of horse car lines in the US. In comparison, the combined mileage of every tram, subway, light rail, and commuter rail system in the US nowadays is 5,416. In 1880, 50 million people lived in the US. Today, over 320 million. Around the turn of the century, many of those horse car systems were electrified. There were then 11,000 miles of streetcar track nationwide. The systems were absolutely everywhere. Even tiny towns like Bangor, Maine and Berlin, New Hampshire had streetcars. So what happened? How did the US go from having 11,000 miles of streetcar to 200? How did the US go from having solid public transportation in towns big and small across the country to how it is today? The decline of the streetcar began just after the turn of the century. That was when the automobile came around. By 1920, the car was starting to get to an attainable price point for the everyday individual. That was the real threat for the streetcar. Not cars, but economical cars.
You know, when you are in the US, when you are the only guy walking on the sidewalk, you have been walking like half an hour. I haven't seen anyone on the sidewalk. I understand. You need to walk so long. Yeah, I'm in Las Vegas. Fuck, I should have rented a car, man. I thought it was gonna be fine. I could just walk everywhere like in Europe. definitely not wrong. I was definitely wrong, man. I walk 1.5 hours to get to Denny's, and I have to walk an hour and a half back.
I love trains, and I'm on America's only sort of high-speed rail, the Acela, so why do I look so pissed off? Because I wanted to be on that train. Time for a rant on the state of passenger rail in the United States. This Sunday I had some very important business up in Baltimore. I had to explore this abandoned hospital with my friend because these x-ray machines weren't going to take sick pictures by themselves. Actually, I think taking pictures of the sick was their primary purpose. I digress. Also, does anybody know what this room would be used for in a hospital? It looks like where you would interrogate prisoners. Okay, back to the trains. After the Acela pulls away, you can see the train that I actually wanted to take, the MARC. MARC is a commuter rail service in Maryland and DC that operates 3 lines. But like most commuter rails in the United States, it has terrible service. 2 of the lines go directly from DC into Baltimore, a combined statistical area of over 10 million people. And yet, this is what the train service looks like for the Camden line on a weekday. You can fit the entire train schedule on a note card. And on a weekend, there's no service at all. The Penn line has a little bit better service, but it's still every 2 hours on a Sunday, so when I missed my train, I had to hop on the Acela. It was expensive, but at least there was an option. It's sad that there's a station in Harper's Ferry, for example, that you can't even use to go on a weekend trip from DC. There's a few reasons for bad service on commuter rails, such as who owns the tracks. Oftentimes the freight companies won't play ball, budgeting, and infrastructure like bidirectional and passing loops. But all of those are problems that could essentially be solved if there was the political will to do so. This map is of DC's 5 commuter rail lines. Could you imagine if all of them had all-day service coming every 15 minutes? It would basically be like providing 5 new metro lines without having to build anything. And this isn't pie in the sky. The state of Virginia has agreed with me, and they spent $3.7 billion acquiring tracks from CSX so that they could do so on the VRE service. And they've already jumped in making improvements that the freight company never would have allowed so that they can start running all-day service. People from Woodbridge won't need a metro extension. They can take VRE. But until then, it's sad how we're at such a low point in passenger service. On the bright side, it gave me a topic idea for my presentation for my transportation planning class.
When I moved to Seattle and stopped owning a car, one of the first things I noticed is that the bus system there, A, is very good, but B, it's not stigmatized at all. Like, you could be rich or poor, everybody rides the bus. Whereas in my home state of Texas, and definitely in my hometown of Houston, riding the bus is seen way more as like a lower class activity. This is a pretty harmful stereotype and a pretty big obstacle towards transit adoption in the US. Because the way a lot of places in the US are set up now, a bus is probably the kind of transit that makes the most sense. I'll try to convince my friends to ride the bus somewhere here in Austin, and it's like pulling teeth.
Okay, so I've been on Walkable Communities TikTok for a while, and I wanted to document the public transportation where I live. I live in Fort Myers, Florida, and just want to show you just kind of what it's like to take a bus here. Okay, so in most parts of the United States, the public transportation isn't great, and I wanted to show you an actual live demonstration of what it is like to take a bus somewhere and how you can get around, and I want to highlight some of the barriers and obstacles. So yeah, come along for the ride. So my goal today is to get from my apartment to the downtown, so downtown Fort Myers. Right now I am walking to the bus stop. It is about a 7-minute walk, so that's not too bad. I also, though, do live, I think it is kind of luck-based because there aren't a ton of bus stops around, and I just happen to live relatively close to one of them. So this is the walk. There are sidewalks the entire way, but it is primarily off of a main road. The sidewalks allow a lot of accessibility. It's not the prettiest walk, but not too bad so far. Because most people have a car to begin with, there isn't much demand for public transportation. And because of that, a lot of times there aren't very consistent routes or pickup points that are convenient to the average person. All right, I'm still walking to the bus stop, but I am almost there. All right, so we have made it to the bus stop. It is this little bench here with the sign. So I'm waiting at the bus stop, and I did a little research about this bus and the frequency that it comes at. So this specific stop, the bus actually comes once every 30 minutes, which isn't too bad, but there are certain buses on the route that only come once an hour, and some of them don't operate at all on Sundays. And they also stop operating after 8 p.m., I believe, and don't start again until 7 a.m. So that's definitely a barrier for people. And while I'm sitting here kind of waiting for the bus, it's also important that I mention that getting to downtown Fort Myers from my apartment would be about a 15-minute drive, and it took me 7 minutes alone to walk to the bus stop, and I've been waiting for the bus for about 5 minutes. So just in terms of relative time, yeah, it's a huge time saver to drive for sure if you have a car. Okay, so update. The bus that was supposed to come never came, so it says there's another one coming in 25 minutes, so I am going to wait. I will keep you updated. I am looking on Google Maps for the bus information. There isn't any bus information over here by the bus stop. So what I mean is there aren't any, like, signs. Google Maps was off because the bus actually came 5 minutes after this, and it was a good ride, and we actually stopped by the ticket center that also had a schedule with all of the bus information, and then I finally made it to my stop. Okay, so I got off the bus, and I am really close to the downtown. It dropped me off it said it was an 8-minute walk away. And there might have been one more stop, but I didn't want to take a chance and get stuck on the bus if it was going in a different direction. So I just got off because it was close enough. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to make a part 2.
Transit systems across the U.S. were built to serve a very specific type of commute, from outside the center of the city to inside it. But studies show that today the most common American commute is actually from suburb to suburb, routes that public transit in the U.S. usually doesn't serve. It's one reason that the overwhelming majority of Americans get to work by driving alone, and there are a few reasons that isn't ideal. First, it means the overwhelming majority of Americans are also required to own a car in order to work, and that's expensive, the second biggest household expense for Americans. And all that driving also means that transportation is the single biggest way Americans emit greenhouse gases, and because most Americans don't rely on public transit, making it better is rarely a top political priority, which makes things even harder for the people who do rely on neglected transit systems. So what would it take to shrink this part of the chart to get more Americans to use public transit? What would that look like? And who has the power to make that happen?
Here's how 24 hours worth of news stories explains exactly what's wrong with transportation in America. Let's start off in New York City, which just finished a new commuter train terminal that cost $12 billion. The latest problem? 1 in 5 of the LIRR's trains won't even fit in that new tunnel. Also in New York, the poorly designed AirTrain to LaGuardia Airport project is officially not happening. The thing is, LaGuardia already has pretty good transit, with a bus system that connects the airport to pretty much every subway line in the city. It's also worth mentioning that AirTrain project would have taken 10 years to complete and cost $2 billion, if not more. Elsewhere in the Northeast Corridor, Boston's Regional Transportation Authority is telling commuters to budget an extra 20 minutes each way. Why? Well, it's all because they lost some pretty important safety inspection paperwork, meaning they can only run their trains at half of their normal speed, at a bustling 10 to 25 miles an hour. Over on the West Coast, there's a dire update on California's high-speed rail project. It's now an open question whether or not the starter line will ever even be finished, and that was supposed to be the easy one. And finally, in Sunbelt cities like Miami and Nashville, traffic has gotten so bad that it's threatening the region's economic future. And again, all of these stories were published within the same 24 hours. We know that the United States has been in a long-time transportation crisis, but things are getting really bad. As car-dependent cities grow and get jammed with gridlock, voters and politicians are in no rush to propose mass transit as a way out. The few half-decent transit systems that we do have are old and breaking down due to a combination of underfunding and poor management. And any attempts to improve our existing systems or build new ones are proving to be so astronomically expensive and take so long that we can't build enough stuff to be actually meaningful. Well, we're finally starting to see what the end result of all of this stuff looks like, which are the 24 hours of news stories that we just talked about. It's just a collective snapshot of a country that's crumbling from the inside out.